Yeah, what are you listening to?
Um, oh, what's her name? She's an Israeli. The song's called Imik Simik, and it's
Hmm.
great. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll link it and send it to you. You'll love it. It's kind of jazzy. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, like check it out. Would you have it like in the background, just relaxing?
no, I was just cranking it.
Yeah, getting hyped, huh?
That's me. Yeah. My kids used to tell me to turn the music down, so that.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you here.
Yeah, yeah. Same here. After that conversation that we had, I was well, I just had a lot of questions about specific things that I wanted to ask you about because you've read more Dugin than I have, right?
Hmm.
And you're also familiar with Heidegger, and I think that that's really important. And I'm not familiar with Heidegger.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, I only, you know, just hear it kind of
Hmm. Yeah. No, for sure.
thing.
What were your main takeaways from that our conversation?
My main takeaway is that nobody really knows what Dugan's saying, and that makes them very suspicious because they don't know what he's up to.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think some of that is intentional on Dugan's part.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I want to talk about,
Hmm.
James. You know, like the thing about Dasein, and you can correct me, like, because I'm not the Heideggerian here, but the thing about Dasein is that it's particular to location, right?
Hmm. Well, according to Dugan, from Dugan's perspective, there is this disagreement: is Dasein universal or is it specific to it is to a location, to a place, but is there a universal Dasein or is there ethnos Dasein? I think that's an open question.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, just knowing German, the word Dasein means to be somewhere, right?
Hmm.
It's being there.
Hmm.
And that there is wherever you are. I
Hmm.
would I would imagine, right? And that can be fractal. You know, that can be in your head, that can be in your soul, and that can be in your physical body, right?
Hmm.
And so, and I'm sure, I'm just guessing, but I'm pretty sure that someone like Heidegger would have thought about it in those terms too, right? As being a mental, a spiritual, and physical Dasein, right?
Yeah, in his later work he uses more. He's an explicit atheist. And he was going to be a Protestant priest. Like he was about to enter the priesthood, and then he switched to philosophy and became a an atheist philosopher. And then his later work becomes really poetic and enigmatic, and he talks a lot about he talks about the fourfold, which is a relationship between man and divinities and the sky and the earth, right? So, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, that's just only one way to go. One way to go, really. Like, when if you start thinking about these things too much, you end up going right, going
Yeah.
there. Um, so I'm trying to what I'm trying to understand. Like we talked about, or I talked about the whole idea of nations, peoples, and tongues in the conversation, right?
Hmm.
And I think that you know we tried to define it. I like Solovyev's idea of a nation being like an organ in a body.
Hmm.
And I mean, that really resonated with me because I've always thought about nations as how they contribute to the whole of humanity.
Hmm.
And I mentioned that I didn't talk about that specifically, but I mentioned Switzerland in the conversation the other day and the contribution Switzerland has made. And the reason I mentioned that was because I think that that's what an organ does. I mean, I never I never said it in light of Soloviev. I've actually talked to my husband about this for years because it's kind of been something I've noticed. India has made contributions to the human to the whole of humanity.
Mhm.
Switzerland, Greece, right? Like these countries have significant contributions that are idiosyncratic to them, right?
Mhm.
Which is, you know, I think I think Solovyev's idea of a nation being an organ is a perfect fit if you think about it like that.
Mhm.
But an organ makes a specific contribution to the rest of the body,
Mhm.
and that without that organ, you're going to struggle to live a healthy life, so to
Mhm.
speak. And so there's a Dasein to that, right? Like there is a Dasein to the organ. It is being there, you know? It's fulfilling its role in a sense as
Mhm.
the liver or the kidney or the heart or whatever. And so if we think about nations like that, do you think that that helps you to understand Dugin better?
Um, I think so, and I think you mentioned Steiner before. You've read or familiar with Rudolf Steiner. He he's talking. I'm reading his book here. Actually, I just picked it up. The Archangel Michael. Have you read that? Have you heard of that from Rudolf Steiner? It's fascinating. It's you know, it's a little bit more esoteric, more kind of what I used to like to, but I still dabble in it. And you know, he thinks of this idea of real spiritual evolution, and you know, we evolve, and you know, bringing in a little bit of Pajot here too, or Jonathan. Like, so a nation state is a organ, but it's also an organism because it's fractal, right? Just like your atoms are organs in themselves, or let it even say, you know, and then your molecules are organs, but they're nested within broader organ and organisms. So it's this simultaneous being a state, being a sovereign, and then also being a part of something.
Yeah.
But the question is like, what is that something? It's not something that we can identify. And I think what Dugin does is he's critiquing this idea of humanity as a whole, not because I don't know, you know, if he believes in humanity as a whole. Like, what does that mean? Who interprets what humanity as a whole means?
So he doesn't talk about humanity as a whole, Dugin?
Not really. Like, but he would say that humanity as a whole has been defined by we're contained within this idea of humanity as a whole that's been defined by liberalism. So that's the, you know, and even we're working through the World Economic Forum and whatnot towards global governance, right? So like this super organism that all these nations are a part of, are organs of, is emerging.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to discern what that is, what that would look like, because there's always the, you know, there's always I feel like we're in this liminal space where things can go either way, right? We could transcend and become some sort of, you know, global community, right? Or things will fall apart. And I think they tend to fall apart more than not at this level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, like you mentioned that Dugin is really familiar with church fathers, and I'm sure that he's, well, actually, I listened. I didn't finish it, but because I was busy today all day. But I got halfway through the paper that Millerman read. He wrote a paper. It's just came out yesterday, I think, and he reads it. And I wanted to send it to you, and it just slipped my mind, and then I was gone. I was in town all day, but he makes he talked about this on Thaddeus Russell's podcast too. He talked about the inner court and the outer court. Did you watch that conversation with Michael Millerman? He's a Dugin expert.
Yeah, I'm familiar with him, and I listened to half of that reading today of him it was like Heidegger, Dugin, I think that is something like that, right? But I was at work, so I didn't really catch a lot of it.
What he talks about there is the high and the low Dugin, right? And he makes the point that a lot of people, and this is his same analogy with the inner and the outer court. So he makes the point that many people approach Dugin, and the first thing they see is the low Dugin. Okay. the one that they have that they can't respect, or that causes them, is morally questionable, let's say. And they make a judgment at that spot, and they don't proceed any further, right? And this is his same analogy with the inner and the outer court. And so Millerman considers himself a mystic, actually. And he talks about the inner and outer court in the same kind of way, where most people approach anything like this, where they approach the outer court, and then either it becomes too difficult, too hard, as in maybe hard to understand or hard to push through, but they turn around at the outer court and they don't proceed to the inner court and then to the Holy of Holies, right? And so he's making an analogy to the tabernacle.
Did he say Holy of Holies too?
He does say in his Thaddeus Russell, he talks about the Holy of Holies. Yeah. And in recent conversation with other people, I've been kind of mulling over the whole, and this has nothing to do with Dugin, but mulling over the whole conundrum of what do you do with people like William Blake, for example? Okay. William Blake is like, you could call him morally bankrupt almost, right? But his poetry and his art is so profound and not wrong. Okay. It's not off. It's actually hitting the mark, in my opinion. And so that's Dugin and Blake. Let's keep them over on the extreme example side. Okay. And then you've got people like King David, his Bathsheba incident. You've got Moses murdering someone, losing his temper, right? You've got all these. So, and it seems to me like the Bible is full of these examples of Rahab. There's another one, right? And they're all in the lineage of Christ. Excuse me. So, and I've always been really awake to that when I read the scriptures, because what it seems to be saying to me is that there are these two things that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with the reality of a fallen humanity, right? And this striving towards God, and those things can appear very different, right, to each other. And if we think about them too hard, we end up leaving when we get to the outer court, or not proceeding any further than the low Moses or the low David or the low William Blake. You see what I'm saying? And so, and Millerman is not necessarily kind to Dugin. He's honest about Dugin. Like I got the text of his talk, of his paper, and he's got links in there. Links to, articles that quote Dugin as saying, kill those Ukrainians, which is actually taken out of context, in my opinion. Because he's not talking about all Ukrainians, actually. He's talking about specific Ukrainians. And excuse me, I think the reason that Millerman is doing that is because he's challenging you to move into the inner court or to encounter the high Dugin. Right? So, and I don't want to say everything at once, but I'll just say this, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts. What really struck me in our conversation was you said you had to step away from Dugin every now and then. Right? It was actually really physically stressful. Spiritually, it felt stressful. And I have this theory about open spaces. So Dugin doesn't give you a map. He doesn't say, we're going to start here, we're going to end up there, right? He basically surrounds you with an environment of ideas, right? Dasein and Carl Schmitt and Plato and all the rest of that. So he throws you into this ecology of ideas, and he wants you to do something with it. It's kind of like Survivor, right? He wants to see what you will do with all that. And that is his fourth political theory. The fourth political theory, I know this much, is not a theory. It is a place. It is a space, right? Which is what Dasein is. You see what I'm doing? And so we have a natural instinct to, and I know this from being a farmer, I watch all my animals and all the prey animals, not the dogs, but the horses, the sheep, the goats, you know, all those kinds of animals. When they enter, let's say, from forest into field, they stop dead at the edge because they're now approaching an open space. And prey animals will approach, like say there's a lake in the middle of that open space. Prey animals will approach the lake in a zigzag pattern. Okay, that's what they do. Predators go in a straight line because they have nothing to fear. And the reason a prey animal doesn't move in a straight line is because it can see almost 360 degrees. So it always has the lake in focus, right? Especially when it's moving in a zigzag pattern. And it doesn't need to be completely like targeted in on where it's going, on its destination. Whereas a predator has its eyes in the front of its face. And it doesn't have as good a peripheral vision. And so when it's heading somewhere, it has to look straight at it and move in that direction. And so when prey animals enter an open space, they stop because they have to look, because there is potential danger everywhere, right? In that open space. And they have to stand there, and they will for a long time. A lot of people think cows are dumb because they'll just stand somewhere forever before they move into the new space, right? So, and we are, as human beings, we're both predator and prey, you see? So when we move into an open space and we don't know what it's requiring of us or what it wants or what else is in it, it's going to kick in all of our instinctual fight or flight, right? A lot of fear is going to happen in an open space, especially when you enter it for the first time. And so anyway, I don't want to say more than that, but I see what Dugin is doing as creating a space, and it's an open space because he's not dictating what it is, right? So he's throwing you into a survivor situation. And when you get thrown into a survivor situation, you're in fight or flight mode. You just are, you know? And then the whole idea of Dasein and how that is fractal in and of itself, right? And how it relates to nations, peoples, and tongues. So those are a lot of the thoughts that I was having during the conversation that I wanted to talk to you about.
You think that the nations, peoples, and tongues, is that continuous, or is that one after the other? Like, does you have the tongues first, then the people, then a nation, where you have the word, the language, right?
I don't know.
I wonder, because then it made me think.
Language affects perception. You know. Yeah.
And you have to have language to have relations with others, and only after you have language, you can communicate with others. Then you can build a larger organism. It's like the code, to create this larger organism. I think that's about right. Sounds about right. And I think, Heidegger calls language the house of being. He says language is the house of being.
Interesting.
And he has this term Lichtung, if you know German, which I don't. Lichtung, Lichtu, yeah. So that's one of his central concepts, and that means the clearing.
I was going to say that's a clearing. Yeah. That's an open space.
Yeah, and that's what he talks about. He even says in one of his articles in Der Spiegel, 1968, magazine, he said that his take was only a God can save us now. He was an atheist. And he said this late, only a God can save us now, because he saw the logic of Gestalt, this inframing, this way of perceiving the world, right? That completely is completely opaque to all of us that perceive the world in this way, right? This one way to view technology and man's relationship to technology, where technology is playing a bigger role than man in a sense, right? And he would talk about in order to appropriate being appropriately, right, there needs to be a clearing where the new can come in a sense. You know, he kind of yeah.
Well, I mean, now that kind of makes sense to me as to why Dugin would do that. He made a clearing. That's what he's doing with the fourth political theory.
Yeah. Why
it's Heideggerian to him.
Yeah, I think so. I think he holds, he's very well read, but he holds Heidegger probably to the highest, kind of regard. And he thinks that, and to your point, right, Heidegger was a Nazi for a very short period of time. So he's one of those, just recently when these black books came out, where some of his, I guess, writings or thoughts on National Socialism came about, all of a sudden on the left, especially if you're into Heidegger, he was a Nazi, and there's this idea, same thing with Carl Schmitt, right? There was a lot happening at that time, right? In Nazi Germany after the fall of the Weimar, just in that general milieu. And even before, the early 20th century. And there's a lot of these thinkers and writers that have become all of their work has been banished, and you're not allowed to engage with it because of the, because of Nazism. Right. Yeah. So I think, part of that is, someone like Dugin is in that same boat because he's part of Russia, right? Putin's brain. And there's all these concepts and these ways that these people are represented to us where, it makes people not look, not want to look. And then when you have someone that looks and they start, and then when somebody looks and starts talking about it, like I felt really like, put myself in a certain way by talking about Dugin on YouTube, where I had to think a couple of times before I posted stuff. I'm like, it's strange to, it's like self-censoring in a sense, and I say at the beginning of the videos, I'm like, this is for educational purposes. Let's explore to look, right? So I think a big part of it is looking to see what's there. And
here's a question. Socrates was executed, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he chose to die rather than be banished, instead of leaving, he said, I'll stay. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. Maximus the Confessor, I was listening to a podcast recently. I can't remember which one it was, but they were talking about how many of the saints in the Orthodox Church were actually tortured and maimed and killed by the church.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, lots of them. Maximus had his hand cut off and,
tongue cut out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And Origin too. Origin was tortured. Yeah.
And, in the scripture, it says that essentially, whoever speaks the truth will be, cast out of their home, especially by their family and in their home. So there's some, I think, trope there, some pattern that is real.
I think so too.
Yeah. I think it's hard to look currently and try to discern who are those that are speaking truly kind of deleterious concepts and ideas and those who are speaking the truth. I think it's hard to discern that.
Mm-hmm.
Like
when you talked about this whole idea of sifting through the debris, about and looking for gold. I mean, that's kind of been how I've navigated my way through life. Like, I've never been afraid of the garbage, right? Because I always knew that there was a gem in there somewhere, because God is everywhere, present, filling all things, right? And if I hold that in my mind, I know that I'm going to find truth somewhere, right? Because Christ, the Logos, is truth, and he's everywhere.
Yeah.
And so that's always been the impetus for me personally to push past the outer court and into the inner court. And, perhaps one day into the Holy of Holies, something like that.
Yeah.
But
Heidegger talked about the few that he was very pessimistic about how the world was heading. And he said that so much so, he said, only a God can save us. He said, in this time, as things disintegrate, there'll be a few that will stand in the clearing that will stare into the abyss, essentially, right? To create a clearing for the new to emerge, right? And he talked about what the new was to him, like it was a new beginning, that, right? So the first beginning, and he thinks philosophically here and theologically, but he makes philosophy kind of the primary source here. The first beginning was the question that initially occurred to the pre-Socratics to wonder what is philosophy. The first inkling for people to start thinking philosophically, that was the beginning, right, of this way of being. And he says that the pre-Socratics, and especially Socrates, he took this notion of this, the first and the inkling of philosophical intuitions, and he created his forms and his idea, where there's this realm of the forms, right? This ideal area, and then truth is whether or not the particular comports to the form, and the more fidelity you have to the form, the good, the true, the beautiful. These are forms that exist eternally, and what truth is a correspondence theory to the ideal realm. And he says that's problematic, right? He says so we need to go back to what philosophy was and create a new beginning and start asking questions, right? And any answers that are going to come almost automatically, or they're going to come to mind, are going to be primed by this way of thinking. It's hard, it's almost impossible to escape it. So
that's why the need for the clearing.
Mm-hmm. And the need for the tolerating the uncomfortable, because your identity is tied up with, the way you think and the way your civilization thinks. So when you start looking at the edges and you start have to really criticizing the political structure, whatever it may be, it's uncomfortable because it's part of your identity, literally,
And if you have to let something go, that's a death, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I mean, again, there's the limbic system, the fight or flight, right? Like you're either running away from it or you're terrified of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's why it's the few who just push into it. Like, many people would call that the hero, the guy who goes out knowing all the cost, knowing all the risk,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've always said that you have to want to know what you don't want to know. You have to be in that way of living,
mm-hmm.
of being in the world, because otherwise it doesn't unveil itself. Nothing unveils itself to you because you just don't look for it, because you
mm-hmm.
don't want to, right? And it seems rather simple, but we are really not that complicated when it comes to these things. Like, we're pretty base creatures, I think,
Mm-hmm.
And so you always have to be aware, which I always have been, even as a little kid, like I've told people, when something makes me really afraid, I do that. Like, here's an example. I was walking back to our lake one day and I saw these 3 black shapes ahead of me on the road. And I was like, oh, our cows are out here. Usually they were at the lake. And then I went, wait a minute, we don't have any black cows. And it was a mother bear and 2 cubs, right? And my first instinct was to hide. And I hid behind a rock, right? And then I'm like, okay, now what? And then I thought, well, find out what direction they're going in. So I'm like peeking.
Mm-hmm.
And I see them cross the road, and and then I said, all right, they're going that way, I'm gonna go that way.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't go home. I just went the long way around because I was checking cows actually that day.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people would, I think, just be scared and stay hidden or run back, go backwards, right? Whereas Like I remember seeing a skunk cross the road once when I was in public school, and I thought, oh, I want that. So I followed it. And then I got really close to it. And then I thought, how do I catch it? It's going to spray me. Like I've always been like that, you know. A friend and I were moving with a big tractor. We were moving an old vehicle, and this rodent was running around in circles on the ground, and I just picked it up, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've never had that instinct to be afraid. Or if I was afraid, I would push myself past it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I mean, I've been bitten, right? And I put myself in danger because of it. But at the same time, I feel like I really understand what Millerman is talking about when he talks about this low and this high Dugin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I think about it in terms of William Blake, you know, a lot of people are afraid of Dugin because because of current events, let's say, right? And but Dugin's been around for a long, long time, and William Blake is not political. Like he wasn't, you know, he's not tied to any kind of political current event, but he's just as terrifying, I would say. I mean, he is to me, you know.
How so?
Oh, because he's way, like he's in the Holy of Holies, William Blake, to me. And he's talking about things that you have to be ready to hear, you know, I think. Otherwise, you end up like feeling like you did when you were reading Dugin, the same way,
Yeah.
You know. Like I downloaded a bunch of his poetry, and I've been listening to it on Audible. And I mean, I've woken up in the morning with images running through my mind, and I'm in Blake world, and I'm not intentionally there. It's just there because it's so profound, right? And I'm like, okay, wait, no, let's just get up, open the curtains, have some coffee. Like, I don't want to be in Blake land right now. It's too weird, you know?
What's it look like?
Oh, it's a whole bunch of paradoxes, right? That's what it looks like. And to Blake, they were obvious. They weren't paradoxes. The relationship that they had to each other was obvious to him. But because of our presuppositions and our axioms, they're paradoxes. And so Blake just portrays them. And you go, what? You know, like a friend of mine shared a Blake painting of Eliphaz, I think it's Eliphaz in the book of Job. He dreamt of some spiritual being, right, hovering over him in the night. And Blake draws this image, and, you know, there's people in flames below Eliphaz grasping for him in his bed. And then there's this godlike figure, looks like God, you know, the big beard, the old man in the sky kind of God, right? And he's wrapped in a snake. And you're just like, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I am not I haven't read a lot of Blake. That sounds very
intriguing.
Very intriguing. What do you think it means to be in the Holy of Holies? Like, what is it about his words or his ideas that make you think, oh, he's in the Holy of Holies? Like, is he kind of spiritually ascended where, you know, he can observe something like the paradoxes in a way that, you know, he makes sense of them? Would you say?
Well, Blake wrote a poem about double vision. And he said that he has double vision, right? So he just sees. He sees, like, holy is set apart. And it, you know, holy is not something that we can access, or that we're you know, like when Moses approaches the burning bush, God says, take your shoes off, right? And Blake has his shoes off. Like, he's there, right? He's standing on holy ground, and he sees it and he knows. But he can also walk around in the world and know that too. He's not lost. And he calls it double vision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to many people, he would appear crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because who was it? Maybe it was, I'll send it to you. I have this really good article that Callistos Ware wrote. And he talked about Blake, and he said, I think it was in there that I read it, but Blake was able to talk about his visions and the way that he saw things, and he talked about them just matter-of-factly, as if it was normal. And the one thing about Blake, he was quite difficult. People had a hard time getting along with him because he didn't have much patience for superficiality.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of cynical towards people for that reason, because they didn't have that double vision, right? And he would talk about things, and they would say something, they would respond in a way that was just like, it was just hitting up against his reality, and it wasn't penetrating what, there was no communion for him. He was alone, right? But he also lived a very strange personal life. Like, he was promiscuous and probably a little deviant in his sexuality. And there's a line quote that's quoted a lot about him where he asked his wife to be if she pitied him, and she said yes, and he said, okay, then I will love you. Right.
He's it reminds me of kind of like Steiner too, who had these visions, where you could peer into the spiritual space. And he wrote a book called Spiritual Science as well. And it's interesting, you think because we've made this scientific progress, that the vision that you'll have of the spiritual realm will be couched in scientific terms, where you're seeing like the evolution of souls, because we have the evolution of matter and of creatures. And something that Dugin talks about too, at the beginning of this article I read, I don't know if you listen to it, he talks about how there's two clocks, and he brings in Florovsky. I believe there's two clocks. One clock is like seeing the world from the materialist side, and it's a clock that goes clockwise and goes second by second. And in this, and then there's another clock that goes the other way, and looking at it from the spiritual side. It's something he didn't say, but it made me think of one is a countdown, like the spiritual clock is a countdown. And he says that from the materialist side, everything looks fragmented, sequential, beginning and an end. But from the spiritual side, it's whole. It's everything fits and makes sense. There's no probabilities. There's no nothing, right? So it made me think of astrology, right? Our perceiving or trying to perceive and appropriate the heavens is necessarily, limited, even though it can be accurate depending on someone's ability or access, but it is limited, right? But looking at it from the other side, from the spiritual side, it's all perfectly, sensible. And he says that sometimes we can access these super sensible realms and encounter these paradoxes, and they come in the form of fractals within fractals. And he talks about like a psychedelic trip. He says we can do it with drugs, where we take drugs and we enter the spiritual space, but to us, it looks paradoxical. It boggles the mind. Geometric shapes changing into each other, accessing, engaging with beings or entities. So to me, this idea that when psychedelics or trying to cross the space, is like, I feel the paradoxes there are like the flaming sword of the cherubim that's at the gate, where it's like, you're not going to be able to make sense of things because you're still making sense of the things from your limited knowledge of good and evil, right? So you're going to go there and you're going to get terrified. You might get just, struck down by a malevolent being, or there might be a benevolent one, but you're dealing in spaces that, are, that where humans have been relegated from for quite a while, right? But it's interesting that we have thinkers and people throughout history that have been able to gauge or peer into the space a little bit, and they bring in, a little bit from it. And that's, it inspires, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually, while you're talking, I'm thinking about Origin. The fun thing when you're reading Origin is Origin will do thought experiments in his writings. And I mean, a lot of those thought experiments were turned around and used against him, right? Oh, you said this. Well, yeah, he said it, but what was he doing with it? He was thinking out loud. He was entering into a space, right? And saying, what if? And he often says in his writings, because I'm so early in the game here, and he was basically the first person to exegete anything. He said, because I'm so early in the game here, if anyone comes along and sees where I've made a mistake, please correct me. And he says that over and over again in his writings, right? So he's really in exploratory mode, Origin is. And he's not out there either, because he's careful, he's reverent, he loves God, he knows the scripture, right? So, and I mean, anyone who listened to Peterson or got involved in this corner of the internet through that door knows all about the importance of the hero's journey, right? That you have to be willing, you have to voluntarily go out into danger, basically. It's always danger. Like it doesn't come in any other way, right? There's always something out there that wants to kill you or eat you or, and then you have to overcome it. And then you take the treasure from it and you bring it back to your community, right? And that is what Origin was doing. And I think that's also what William Blake was doing. And I think that that's what Dugin is doing. But the hard part about Dugin is that he doesn't actually open the box and say, here's the treasure. He says, you open the box and tell me what you find. That's what he says, right? And that makes people suspicious, and then you get critiques like shapeshifter, manipulative, all things to all men. He only says what you want him to say. But if he is actually honest, and I can't judge that, because I wouldn't even try, right? It's something only God knows. But let's just assume that he's being honest, then he would be all those things, because he wants to know what you think. That's what he wants to know. Because he wants to harvest your intellect for his project. Right? He wants everyone to contribute their consciousness to this fourth political theory. That's what I think. Do you think that's a good estimation?
I'd say that, that's definitely part of it. He says it's a kind of an open source, and he warns that this probably and might not take place, right? This fourth political theory. And it reminds me of kind of God's or Heidegger's edict about God, like only a complete reorientation of our sense of being in the world, a complete reorientation will save us from the catastrophe that's happening, right? And I think Dugin is inviting people to, and I think part of it, that's why he has such a kind of dialed in critique of the West, because the West is the hegemon, right? And I'm not meaning political terms. I mean, just in terms of interpreting the world, the West, right? He criticizes human rights, right? But if you look at that from, oh man, this guy's a demonic. He's criticizing human rights, but he's not criticizing the rights of human beings. He's criticizing this ideology that comes in the guise of human rights. So
even Peterson critiques human rights.
Yeah. So he points at he's pointing at the contradictions. Right? He's saying, look here, and they're becoming more obvious. So I think we're getting, and Dugin wouldn't be as popular as he is now without what's happening now. Right. I was studying him for about not even a year prior to the situation that happened in Ukraine. And it was surreal. And I reached out to Michael. We were, we were going to talk, but he didn't have, he's like, I'm not doing interviews right now. It's like right when this started happening, I'm like, is it surreal to see what's happening in Ukraine? And and you've helped, publish some of Dugin's writings in English. Like, it's just, it's crazy. It's surreal that this came about. And it's weird that a lot of people were looking into Dugin, before of it, outside of it. And all of a sudden this came onto the scene. And it was strange. Like the most watched video ever of mine by far was this one reading that I did of Dugin. I think it was my first reading, and I saw an article, and I'm like, I look at the article and I read it, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm like, that's I don't know why. I'm like, I got to read this for my channel. Like, it was, you get this kind of notion or this intuition, but he's dealing with him is intense, right? But it's exhilarating, right? It's highly intellectually stimulating, but it's draining, it's draining. Yeah.
I mean, he's drawing from so many places where people don't normally draw from. And he's making connections, I think, where people don't normally make connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're just suspicious of that. Well, you can't do that because nobody's ever done that before. So it can't be right.
Well, it's been done from the post, and I cut my teeth and I'm very still interested in postmodernism, right? I'm very interested in it. And he says, he's very interested in it too, but he critiques it as well. So he's like, well, we have to use the logic of postmodernism, right? That logic has within it gold, right? You can't just discard it all. I think where it comes is from his metaphysics of debris, and I think Jonathan plays a role where he's pointing to the symbolism in different domains, whether it's movies or scripture or articles, whatever it may be, right? So he's making us look at all this debris that's flying all around us, at the speed of light now, right? And there's signal there, right? But I think there's a lot of kind of overlap there in a strange way.
Yeah.
But I mean, you got to tread lightly where you feel you got to be pushing yourself, but you don't want to go too far, right? And you don't want to get to the place where you're not going far enough. So it's about that border, the borderland there.
I agree. And for me, I think the key is always kind of curiosity. Like, you're not going to buy in as long as you're curious, because if you're curious, the thing is always going to be a mystery, right? Mm-hmm. Once it loses its mystery, you lose your curiosity. At least that's my experience when I'm doing things like this, kind of trying to understand. What I also think is really interesting about this is that it's not just philosophy in the sense that we often think about it. It's also, there's physical location. It's geopolitics. Mm-hmm. And that I find I like to connect the things that don't necessarily seem connected. And I think that has to do with Dasein,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would encourage you to start reading a little bit, read some Heidegger. If I had it next to me, I'd read some of his later work. I have a couple videos on reading the later Heidegger, which is, I think it's entitled The Apocalypse of Heidegger. And all these connections stood out to me. And I've read the book before, parts of it, before, but this never stood out to me before. And I was like, holy cow, there's just lined up with Orthodox theology, apocalyptic Orthodox theology, like 1-to-1, the words that he was using. I'm like, holy cow. So I started reading it. I actually sent it to Michael Millerman too, because I wanted to have a discussion on it. So he's, his words that he's using there are, converging on what's obviously happening right now. And it's interesting. It's fascinating. But the term Dasein, right? It's almost like he was looking to get outside of the idea of the subject and the object. Like, what is the self? The self is not the self that's embedded in the current culture, right? Is not the self. Like, what is it that presupposes all understandings of the self prior to, primordially prior to being inculcated in a system, right? Whether you're an individual, you're part of a class structure, you're part of a race, you're part of an ethnos. All of these categories, he says, are a result of the degradation, or of what happened initially with philosophy. So he's saying, what Dasein is this opening, this clearing that seeks to reestablish, to reorient, reappropriate what being is, being as such. Because the inaugurating error that was made was conflating being with the capital B and beings and organisms and creatures,
which is really one in many, right?
Yeah. Well, he's saying that's what's happened with this logic that's ending in framing and gestalt, this technological advance. Like it's ending in this destruction of the earth, right, and disaster. What was the more originary sense of being that was being intuited by the philosophers, the pre-Socratic philosophers? And he says that being turned away from beings, where being is looking away from beings, right? So there's a gulf there, and that's where the abyss is, in a sense.
There's a withdrawal.
There's a withdrawal, yeah. And then in place of being, the capital B is nothingness, right? And and we look at all of the contemporary 20th century psychology, psychoanalysis, philosophy talks about subjectivity. Human subjectivity is at the center of human subjectivity is a void, right? And it's and out of that void, this understanding of the self is not all and not there. It manifests itself in our lives as neurosis and depression, and all of these tics that we have, in a sense. So I think Dasein is this way to look at things without the categories that are in the filters that we've been inculcated in. And I think what Dugin is saying is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of modernity, postmodernity, kind of, and even in technology, right? We don't throw out all of that, because it's part of the, that brought us to where we're at. So looking at the debris and looking at the different ideas and concepts and whatever it may be that's shooting off right now as things are falling apart, trying to hold on to something and stitch things together. But the concept of the Dasein is it's the kind of kind of pause in trying to understand, trying to say what it is. Anything we say is going to be always already within the system that we're trying to observe, trying to step out of. But his, this fundamental, he calls it fundamental ontology, is like the difference between being as such and beings as creatures, right? So what can we say about being as such? We've mistakenly made it a category of beings, or it's like a quality of creatureliness, in a sense, where and we suppose that that's it. So there's a big gulf there. So the question is, what is being as such? And I think his writings, I don't know that he had any access or understanding or awareness of Orthodox, the fathers. Yeah. I don't know how much, I know in the English speaking language, Orthodox theology is relatively new in terms of being translated in English, super new. Yeah. So it's interesting to put Orthodox theology in dialogue with some of these notions like psychoanalysis and human subjectivity and what it means to be a self. And I wonder if Heidegger had access, or it doesn't seem like he did when he left the priesthood, because all of his ideas are rooted in theology, like, and what I see as Orthodox theology, right. Like the energy, the essence, energies, distinctions. There's so many mappings, and I don't know if that's just because I'm steeped into Orthodoxy right now and I'm just seeing something that's wishful there. But there's a connection that's there that I think is fascinating. There are some Orthodox, John Zazoulas and Yanaris, that have written pretty extensively on it, that have pointed it out.
I have Being as Communion. I still haven't read it.
Yeah.
By Zazoulas.
Yeah. No, I haven't read that either. But yeah, like that's in, even Being as Communion, right?
Well, see, this is the thing. Like I keep thinking about what you were saying when you were talking about Heidegger's being as such and being the creaturely beings, right? Well, if they don't have, if they're not in communion, then there is no logic to the world, logos, right? It doesn't exist. Then you're just the creaturely being is floundering around with nothing to attach itself to, and being itself has, become hidden.
That's the death of God, right?
Yeah.
God didn't die. It's our, Nietzsche even said, God is dead and we've killed him. The blood is on our hands.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. God doesn't die. We've cut out the structure that holds us up as a people, and that will eventually lead to, the logic will eventually lead it to disintegration. And something Dugin talked about, and I didn't know if I communicated it well or if you came across, his critique of liberalism and his critique of communism and his critique of fascism kind of share the same. Well, liberalism specifically, it took all of the classifications that we participate. Let's say that all the organs that human beings are in, God, right, religion, nation state. Even now we see it's not even, high status to say you're an American or you're part of a nation. Like nationalism has gone. So on the one side, is this a necessary next step to this global superorganism, or is it the destruction of humanity itself? Because he says that we're granulating this disentanglement from all classification all the way to male and female. That is the last classification, where we have to disentangle from male and female, right? Yeah. And in Orthodox, orthodoxy, it kind of talks about gender in a very different but similar way as that, right? Where the soul does not have a gender in a sense, and there's experiencing both genders on this plane, right? And sacrificing whatever gender you have through marriage to embody the subsequent gender. Like, so it's like what's happening, but it seems like the latter, looking at it from our perspective, at least now, that it's not good what's happening. Like, it's not a healthy, like the mental health of the people that are subject to, let's say, the trans LGBTQ, like trans community, political community. I don't mean the community. I don't even see it as a community. Like these, it's people, and yeah, and this ideology, yeah, exactly, right? So you see what's happening with libs of TikTok and all of these videos and stuff. It's like these people, they don't have well-being. They have they have issues coping, right? And it's hard. Is it because of this innate thing that they have, or is it because of the ideology that's being applied, from the outside? So it looks like, and Dugin takes from that, it says that, that's the logic of neoliberalism, is to disentangle the human being from all categories.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember when being a nation was a good thing. Getting, singing the national anthem, being Canadian, like in the 70s and stuff, there was a sticker that a lot of Canadians would put on their backpacks when they were traveling in Europe, said proud to be Canadian on it, because the Europeans were anti-American. And it was better if you were Canadian, if you had a proud to be Canadian sticker on your backpack.
Yeah. It wasn't that long ago that it was, it was a positive thing to be patriotic. Yes. So I was intuiting something a couple of years ago. I bought my first American flag ever, like 2 or 3 years ago. And I never was a patriotic, like outwardly patriotic person, especially because when I was going to school, everything was Marxism. It was anti-national, right? But then I intuited what's happening now. It's like, oh, the thread's falling apart. Like you've lost your connection with all of these structures, right? The nation state's like the only one that's left. And that's now, Trump supporters are the ones that have flags, and they're looked at as like they're sick or something, it's like,
and that's what I wanted to talk about, because nationalism has been equated to Nazism. because that's what Nazi was. Nazi stands for nationalism, right?
National socialism, right?
Nationalismus is the full term, right? The social democrats. And statehood is equal to, it is for the purposes of commerce, right? Like the state, China, right? United States, Canada, they have to exist for taxation purposes, to control populations, to enact the law, and to trade, right? And now they're trying, but they're. It seems to me like they're trying to wipe out nationalism, and it's become a bad word, but it's because they're blurring all the lines when it comes to identity, right? You're making the human being homogenous.
And
then,
why?
Yeah, because if they can do that, it's a soup, okay? It's a liquid. And when you have a liquid form of something, you can flow it wherever you want. And there's no attachment to the place. See? And this is why I find Heidegger and Dugin so interesting, because they're insisting on a location, right? As part of an identity. And I think that's true. I believe that's true. Like my little, when I tricked you into showing your Greek colors, you know. I've traveled enough in the world to see that there's a Greekness in the way that people are. Their Dasein. Like, I really understand what he's talking about, right? It's not attached to any kind of political ideology or anything. It's a Dasein. It's a being there. It's being Greek. It's being Irish. It's being Swiss, you know. I have a friend who studied like early European history, all the tribes, and you know, he used to tell me all these stories about the barbarians and the you know, all these different peoples that moved all over Europe. And him and I, we used to track how some of the characteristics of those tribes are still present in the people today, right? Personality traits, or I don't even know what you would call them, but they weren't they're more innate inside the person. The Dasein of the person is connected to them as a people. And of course, they were small, but they were still a nation, right? They were the whatevers, you know, the Romans or the barbarians or the what, you know. And if you look far enough back into European history, you can see a kind of continuation of that Dasein in the people today. Especially, like, I'm familiar mostly with German early history, you know, Austrian, Swiss, and Germany. And I mean, I can't think of an example right offhand, but there was always this need, and it sounds stereotypical, but if you look back, they weren't going to give in ever to a conquering nation. They were always going to be the conqueror. And they conquered Rome, or they got rid of Rome against all odds. Okay? They pushed Rome out, right? And they were very smart, very intelligent, very, and I don't mean crafty in an evil way, but almost technically logical, right?
Yeah.
The way that they thought things through. That's why they could do what they did. That's why they could push back such an amazing army, like the Roman army, right? And they're still like that. You know, I mean, who introduced the euro? Germany did. Who introduced the idea of a European Union? Germany did, right? Who's one of the strongest nations in the European Union? Germany is. Now, it's a soft takeover. Everybody is conciliatory, so to speak. I don't know about Greece. but it's still what it is. And it hasn't really changed since Roman times.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it through. They were intelligent. They were logical. They give you all the reasons that you need to say yes to them. Okay. But you're still saying yes to them. Okay. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So people, it's weird. Our memory seems to just exist in the 20th century, right? Because the retort to that would be, also Germany, National Socialism sprouted out of Germany, right? So this being able to instantiate an identity, right, through technical, philosophical, intellectual means, right, can go off the rails. And since in our memory that's gone off the rails and it's impressed in our memory just recently, any attempt at something like nationalism, right, is to being proud of where you're from, your culture, the place you're from, right, is looked at as fascism. That's fascism. That's why everything's called fascism. So there's this hyper overreaction towards a placelessness, right, and that's why people are floating around, their identity. There's nothing to identify with.
Well, they're liquid.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's what it feels like to me.
It's Deleuze and Guattari had something called schizoanalysis, where he said that the ultimate logic of capitalism and late capitalism is to create this schizophrenic way of being in the world. And it's not necessarily the diagnosis of schizophrenia, right? But, you're just a receptacle for ideologies or a receptacle for ideas that come and go. There's no rootedness there, and it's, so it's interesting what's going to happen. Can we go back to a nationalism? Can we go back to a people, right? There's no going back. I mean, the whole idea of America was this, and exporting globalism was we have technology now, we need to develop a global consciousness. What happens to the individual Daseins?
This is why I think Heidegger's idea and Dugin following through with it of the clearing is so important, because you actually have to clear away all the garbage, all the debris, right? So that people don't fall into the trap of it. There are lots of nationalists that are actually fascist. You don't want to, throw up a big sign and attract all those guys, right? So you have to make a clearing. You have to start over. This is the thing, right? You do actually. And that's why I find this whole idea of Dasein so interesting, at the way that Dugin is using it and geopolitically using it, right? Because he's appealing to place without appealing to nationalism.
Say another term for place in terms of it would be function, right? If we have this global organism and we have the Germanic people with their being and the Greek people, the Indian people, right? There's something there that functions in the world, that functions in the broader world. So this homogenization, this exporting of globalism and homogenizing and reducing all cultures to consumerism, right? Is cancer.
Yes.
Like, if you have cancer cells are in each organ that you have, right? Cancer cells just replicate. There's no differentiation. They're undifferentiated and they kill the organism. This is a form of cancer. So I understand where you're coming from. And I appreciate that. What Dugin's trying to do as well is like trying to, save the difference in cultures while having to live in a global world, because there's no going backwards.
Right.
So how do you do that? And I give him credit. He's thought it through with, his these breaking the world off into these meridians where you have, the United States is the center, then Canada and that South America. And then you have, Europe, Russia, the southern continent, and he actually puts Europe and Germany as the center, the thing that kind of administrates and secures that region. And it's interesting because you speak to the competency of the German people. So it would make sense that they're in the middle, right? And you give them the autonomy, the sovereignty, the ability, the space to be their own people, right? And then the same thing in Asia with China at the center, right? Yeah, that sounds great. Could preserve the cultures. Everybody gets along together, but there's this force like Tubal Cain, right? There's this force. We live in a fallen world, and there will always be this force. We can call it technology, right? Driven, or technology is leveraged to keep people's fighting against each other, and that will that go away? No. How's that going to go away? But maybe it will. But
yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that Dugin has a great idea and we should all, because actually we don't even really know what his idea. His idea is Dasein. That's his idea. Is on a geopolitical scale, right? Dasein geopolitically, and I think to think about that in an open space, right, is to allow for a metanoia in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. Because then you don't have to think about it in terms that have already been utilized and are full of baggage, like nationalism mm-hmm. or globalism, or, because he is talking about a kind of globalism, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
Where the whole earth functions as a whole, right? As a global organism. And that's why I thought it was so interesting reading Soloviev and finding out that he felt the same way about humanity, that it was a unity, right? That humanity was a whole, but that the nations were like organs and mm-hmm. they contributed in a particular way. And he even says that they have calling from God for those particular ways that they contribute. Mm-hmm. But because of our 21st century mindset now, to say that a nation has a particular calling is to sound like a Nazi. Right?
And you're called
you have to have the clearing. Mm-hmm. And so you have to call it something else.
It's white supremacy. That's what they mean. Science is white supremacy. 2 + 2 = 4 is white supremacy, right? That's the term that they use to apply to especially to the European strain, I was listening to James Lindsay. You listen to his YouTube?
I haven't. I mean, I thought you were going to talk about the Jonathan Peugeot conversation, but I haven't listened to it yet.
Yeah, James is doing great work. That conversation is wonderful, but he's going into a deep dive on the critical pedagogist, how do you say that? Paul Fieri, mm-hmm. who is essentially the critical theorist that we base our education off of. And he goes through his writings and he talks about it's an explicitly theological Marxism that is being, that we are being inculcated to. He says, not just like metaphorically religious, like the way that he's talking about, Fieri talks about we need to use language to proclaim the world, And we need to use language to create the world, but it's all couched in social justice theory and demagoguery kind of. Yeah. And it's upon us now, so he's doing the work. I think that's why it was such a fruitful conversation with Jonathan, that there is this parasite, right? Mind virus, whatever you want to call it, that is present, right? It's here. It's here. All right. There's no trying to get rid of it. It'll be pointed to some scapegoat and you'll apply it to the Jews or to Trump supporters. You know what I'm saying? If you try to address it, it's shifted, like a parallax happens and it's applied to a certain people, so there's almost we need a different way of comporting ourselves towards this mind virus, the machine, as Paul Kingsnorth, talks about it, right? There is this machine there. We can't look at it straight in the eyes. And I think this is where Christ comes in and his teachings are, this is it. How do you deal with a mob, right? How do you can't deal with it it's very clever. The swarm, the hive mind, Satan is very clever. It's clever than all of us. Yeah. So I think part of entering this clearing, we'll have to address this. You're on TikTok, you're on, you say, oh, how can somebody be, teaching kids X, Y, and Z? And it's easy to become outraged because it's outrageous, horrific stuff, but we need to react to it a different way. And I think that's what's sort of emerging, hopefully now.
Talking about that, Jesus said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was his way of non-judgment, it was compassion, empathy. And he died for them.
This just kind of came to me. Was he saying that to his father? Was he telling his father, like, Lord, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do? Or he was acting as Christ, right? The second person of the Trinity, proclaiming, Father, forgive them. What is the countenance there? Who's he speaking? Is he speaking to his father saying, forgive them for they know not what they do? Or was he in speaking those words, he was outlining, a part of the kingdom of heaven. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And, John Bear makes a really good point when Pilate, when he's standing before Pilate, and Pilate says to him, well, are you not going to defend yourself? And Pilate knew he was innocent, right? And Jesus didn't say anything. He kept his mouth shut. And what's fascinating is that he had every right to. Pilate probably would have let him go if he would have defended himself, but he didn't. And then Pilate's response was, behold the human being, right? Like, this was the absolute image of the humanity of Christ. This was the higher order of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't, that this is why the whole idea of human rights, I also question. Not that I think people should be tortured, but as an individual, I don't have any rights. As a Christian, actually, I don't have any rights, right? Because I'm, like John Bear said, the only thing that we're asked to do is die. Right. Die to ourselves. I watched a really good conversation with John Bear once, and the guy asked him how he felt about homosexuality. And, John Bear's been criticized by members of the Orthodox Church for being too liberal. And I wondered, now what's he going to say? And he said, I don't really want to say much more than this. As Christians, we're all required to die. Mm-hmm. And he just reiterates it, right? And so, yeah, that's just the way it is.
Heidegger said that he discerned authentic being, right, juxtaposed against das Man, which is the man, the horde, the swarm, right? And he says that in order to, kind of realize, you have to live resolutely, and he called it being towards death. And it's our finitude that defines our project in our life, right? So, being towards death is how resolute Dasein, emerges in a sense, right? But we've faced death from, and we talked about this in our last talk, right? Death has become this thing that we hide away in morgues and in hospitals, and when the person's dead, the body's hidden, and then it gets buried quickly, right? Yeah. So there needs to be a clearing opened in the space of death to not that death is good, right? We can't make declarations about what death is, because then it's going to be a reaction. It's going to be still within the old system. So I like the idea of the clearing, right? Clearing to appropriate what it means for being towards death, right? And then, a martyr is a witness, the same term in Greek. To witness means to be martyred, to witness the truth, is martyrios, right? It's a martyr. So death is an important role, is an important aspect of being that it's the point of life. Death is the point of life. It's a point.
Yeah, it's a convergence, right?
But that could be like suicide bombers also think that, right? So that's why it's a delicate.
So if you think about it in these terms, like when you're born, you emerge into death, and when you die, you emerge into life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like it's just kind of mind bending to think about it, right? You're born and you emerge into death. This is why I think Job said, I wish I was never born. He wasn't wishing that everything would go away. He wasn't closing his eyes and then hoping that the whole world would be different. It was being itself that he didn't want. He was refusing to be in the world, because with it came all the death, right? All the suffering. And so as soon as you enter into the world, out of the womb, you're now confronted with death. And when you die, it's the other way around. It's life. So it's a really interesting flip, right? And this is the whole idea of trampling death by death, in my opinion. I've thought about it we have forest fires here, and oftentimes forestry will do like a back burn up to the fire if the wind is right. So that if the fire is moving this way and they have wind this way one day, they'll back burn up to it, and then the fire goes out because it runs out of fuel. And I thought, oh man, that's trampling death by death. Like Jesus back burned up to it, right?
Yeah.
And then it has no more fuel. And his death was life. It was literally life, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, that's a mind bender, but
yeah, why and I gotta pop off here. Kids back there, but the question is, why were we put in this situation in the first place? Like, death was trampled by death, but why did we emerge in this place to have to engage with this paradox, this riddle? Like, what? Why were we squeezed into this world? And Heidegger, and I'll leave you, like, Heidegger has this idea that it's called thrownness. I forgot what it was. I forgot the German term. Thrownness. Our being is thrownness. We're thrown into the world, and into a world and kind of in between things. There's stuff that happened before us, and trying to figure out why were we thrust into this space all of a sudden. I think we'll pick that up at another time, but
that would be great.
Yeah, because I don't know, but I think a lot, I appreciate engaging with you. So some good stuff came up.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm glad we got the opportunity.
Yep. Till next time.
Okay.
Bye. All right. Thanks. Bye. Good night.